Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to start off by thanking Robin for accepting our invitation to interrupt his trip back to New Brunswick from overseeing the Canadian Association of University Teachers Conference in Ottawa, but also to acknowledge and thank the generosity of Dr. Michael D. Paul, whose support makes these workshops and events possible, as well as to the Azrieli Foundation, whose support also enables a wider initiative of bringing our archives and special collections up from the depths of the library to you. The emergence of the Index of Prohibited Books in 1556-ish enjoyed a very long life. It was only in 1966, a little over 400 years later, that the book ceased publication, which isn't such a bad run from one perspective. From another, however, it categorically altered the trajectory of European literary culture. As I think Robin will show in his talk, the Catholic Church, while often perceived as a monolithic and homogeneous entity, issued successive iterations of the index that spawned nothing less than internal debate, contradiction, and conflict within the entity, and to my fascination, yielded some residual benefits to scholars. Robin's book is, I think, the first comprehensive study of the index, and while you might think initially that it's written exclusively for scholars, it's not only accessible and entertaining, it was, at least for me, nothing short of riveting. I was thinking a couple of days ago about some of the more contemporary examples of censorship, perhaps the most ironic one being Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, about a fireman who transforms from burning outlawed books to saving them. And this was a novel that was banned and censored by various schools in the US for questionable language and vulgarity. As well, Orwell's 1984, which is all about the control of information, was also banned in the Soviet Union and in Jackson County, Florida, for promoting communism. It's with this in mind that we've structured the afternoon as a combination book launch for Robin, but also the opportunity to share a couple of examples from our own rare books collection that show evidence of, let's just say, explicit and implicit mediation. These books I'll be showing as the second part of the session are also on display in the library with a few others, and I would encourage you to go have a look at them when you can. The exhibit will be up for 3 months-ish, but for now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robin Vose.
Yes, thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's lovely to have quality over quantity in the room. I'm looking forward to this intimate discussion, and I can't tell you how delightful it is for me to be back in Montreal, because I did start my academic career here, and I really left a piece of my heart here, and it's nice to be back. So thank you very much to Eddie, Paul, and Ellen Benshaw, and Etzel Carter, and all the staff here at the Jewish Public Library. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, again, with an engaged and thoughtful audience, I presume, of book lovers, people who care about books, and people who support libraries, and therefore clearly value and understand the importance of books. Libraries are central to the story of the index, and libraries are, of course, essential for the preservation of books and the knowledge that they contain, but as I discovered in my research, they can also serve as sites for deliberate erasure and loss as well. And the history of book censorship has a lot for us to reflect on, not just about the past, but as Eddie suggested, about the present and the future. Many cautionary tales here, so again, I'm very happy to have this time with you today, and I'm going to try and work through some of these issues at the end, maybe even in a controversial way, and we'll see what you guys have to say. Again, it's nice to have a small room where you can have lots of discussion and you hear your ideas on this stuff. So my book, here it is. There it is as well, was a long time in the making. I actually first started doing historical research, as I said, here in Montreal. And my interests were piqued, my interest in inter-religious conflicts and so on, after spending a year in Israel at Kibbutz Alonim, and then also several months in Ecuador on a Canada World Youth Exchange. And this all confirmed my interest in how the modalities of how different religious, political, and also cultural and linguistic groups, communities have negotiated their differences over the centuries. And of course, as you all know, Montreal was, at that time, and remains itself a fascinating place for studying these kinds of issues. I mean, we've got the tensions between French and English, but then in the 90s when I was here, joined with renewed attention to Indigenous experiences in the wake of Oka. And more recently, there's the Truth and Reconciliation process, which is on a lot of our campuses. Not to mention the ongoing deliberation and conflict over Middle Eastern politics, which were just as heated during the Intifadas and the Gulf Wars of my youth as they are now. Tragedy abounds throughout this period. But to get historical perspective, I was able to find an especially exciting historical laboratory for a more disinterested analysis of intergroup conflicts when I fortuitously ended up at the University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute in 1997, just right at the time in 1997 as the Rare Book Library there came into possession of the world's largest remaining private collection of materials for study of the Catholic Church's various inquisitions. And you can see how happy I am working with these documents and how cold it was. Further doors were then, and this is totally fortuitous, but further doors were then opened for the study because the very next year in 1998, the Vatican finally agreed to make the holdings of the Roman Inquisition's own secret archive available to scholarly research. And yes, there is still an Inquisition at the Vatican. This building is still active. It's right beside St. Peter's Basilica. You can go in if you know the secret word, and they have comfy chairs in their archive.
What's the secret word?
Well, I could tell you, but exactly. It's a lot of it's about looking confident as you walk past the Swiss guards, it turns out, like anything else. But this was amazing because this archive had been closed for hundreds of years, and it just happened that as I was starting my graduate work that it opened up. So, this also added to the holdings of the parallel Inquisition archives in Spain. The Spanish government had seized the archives back in the 19th century, so those were more open. But even there, during Franco's reign, it was pretty hard to do that research. So the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, which has a lovely research room. In Portugal, in Mexico, the Mexican Inquisition archive is fascinating because it's actually held in the old Legumbre prison. It's a panopticon prison, and all the books are in cells, and the research is done in the cell blocks, which adds to the sense of studying Inquisition documents in a very interesting way. They also have cats wandering in and out. And I did research in Chile as well, where the Peruvian Inquisition archives ended up. Each of these archives has their own fascinating history as they've continued to evolve into fully usable research depositories. So just my luck, the last couple of decades have offered really unprecedented access to the actual files and records of the institutional bodies responsible for controlling and censoring ideas and texts that were deemed unacceptable to the Catholic hierarchy. And a new generation of scholars has been gradually using these records to significantly revise what we thought we knew about this aspect of religio-cultural discipline as it existed in the late medieval and the early modern periods, and again, as Eddie mentioned, right up until the middle of the 20th century. And I think I can say that this is the first really comprehensive study of the whole history, partly because of this. It was not possible to study in the same way before 1998, and scholarship, it really takes 20 years before we can really process all this information. So there will hopefully be more studies like this, and I was hoping that this would help to orient people. Welcome. So not my creativity or anything else. It's just I was in the right place at the right time, and the archives have opened. So it's a wonderful thing to contribute to this. So as I say, my main contribution to this exciting new work has thus far been this book with its pretty self-explanatory title. It's about the 400-year history of the Catholic Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum. That's a frontispiece from an 18th century edition. You see they're pretty proud of what they were doing. So the Index of Prohibited Books, which, as we say, only ceased to be compiled in 1966, and which still, I discovered in my research, maintains a certain spiritual authority for many Catholics today. I met a few people at Notre Dame who were very nostalgic for this book and wished that it was still around. But of course, 400 years of anything is likely to get pretty complicated. And this image I took in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, it shows 4 different editions of the index. You can just see physically how it changes in size and layout. To the left, you have the earliest. It reaches a high point in the red one, and then they realized that was too big and nobody could use it anymore, and so they went back to a smaller one later on. So it's complicated and it has an evolution. So my challenge was to try and give readers a more or less clear overall sense of why and how this censorship list came to be, and how and why it later evolved over time in its particular institutional settings. And again, hoping to inspire other scholars to go deeper, where I was, skimming the surface sometimes. This is just an image of what the actual text looks like in the center. This is the Roman index from the early Tridentine version. And you see just lists of names and authors, but also titles, some of them strangely vague. If you read Latin, the Liber Inscriptus in Orationem Dominicam, etc. I mean, they didn't actually have titles for some of these, and so they would just say, a book that starts with these words. Anyway, lots of interesting questions about how you actually censor books that you don't know the title or the author of. Now, the Catholic Church, I should mention, has, of course, never held a monopoly on book censorship, and the Protestants did a great job of book censorship as well, and all religions, really. Most religions, governments, and other authoritative organizations that take an interest in controlling their members' beliefs and behaviors have at some point engaged in some sort of disciplinary control over those members' access to information. Sometimes it can be fairly minimal, but often in history with dire consequences for those who transgress the rules. The index, though, I didn't target it as an anti-Catholic gesture per se. It's just that the index provides a particularly fascinating case study in censorship because the project was maintained for over 400 years and because its reach very soon, immediately actually, stretched over much of the globe because of the colonization moment that happened around the same time. It changed a lot along the way, but I can't think of any other institutionalized framework for book censorship that has ever lasted so long or impacted so many people worldwide. So the Index of Prohibited Books really did begin in the mid-16th century, and it began then specifically as a response to the twin challenges of the Protestant Reformation. We have Luther here and Luther's German Bible, which really upset a lot of Catholics, and Erasmus, who was on and off the index for a long time, all associated with the Reformation. So that was an instigator. That was a crisis for the Catholic Church to deal with, the challenge of Protestant books and Protestant interpretations of the Bible. But there had been heresies before that they had dealt with, but this was combined with the simultaneous emergence of print technology, which permitted the unprecedented rapid diffusion of Protestant and other ideas throughout Catholic Europe and beyond. Before this Protestant/print moment, the Church had only occasionally gone through formal processes of denouncing written texts. They had burned things from time to time, but they had rarely had a formal process for it. The most famous case where they did have actual legal cases, debates, and process was the on-again, off-again suppression of the Talmud from 1240 on. In 1240, there was a famous trial of the Talmud in Paris, and it was literally treated as a heretic, and it was burned at the stake. Cartloads of Talmud manuscripts burned at the stake. Debates between rabbis and Franciscan preachers at the University of Paris over the propriety of the texts in the Talmud. So books would be forbidden and or destroyed from time to time by the Catholic Church on a one-off basis. But in the age of painfully slow and expensive manuscript copying, the main concern was actually with oral, communal circulation of ideas that were deemed heretical or blasphemous to Catholic ears. The books weren't so much the problem. The books were more a symptom of a deeper problem of people talking about bad things. So the books weren't the target. So there was very little need to create any sort of official list of banned books at a time when books themselves were so rare and generally circulating in unique copies, and again, often without an author's name or even a title. But even in medieval times, some of the problems that would later return to haunt early modern church censors had already become evident. The Talmud and other Jewish writings such as Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, and here's a lovely Italian manuscript from about 1400 of the Mishneh Torah. These writings were a major case in point because the texts were condemned and in some cases seized and at Paris in 1240 burned once the Catholic officials became aware that they allegedly contained potentially anti-Christian passages. But they were also seen very quickly, by the 1260s at least, by some church theologians as extremely important resources for Catholics for understanding the true meanings of complex scriptural passages, what they called the Hebraica Veritas, or the Hebrew truth. And if you're familiar with the Barcelona Disputation of 1263, that was what was very much at stake. This is a later woodcut of St. Jerome, the translator of the Bible into the Vulgate Latin, supposedly with his Hebrew books in front of them. They're kind of fake Hebrew, but this is the idea, is that the Hebrew truth is important and that Catholics should own this. It's part of the Catholic theological theory that the Catholic Church is in fact verus Israel, like we are the true Jews. The mantle has been passed. We are now the chosen people. Therefore, we should own that intellectual past. So the challenge for these Catholic theologians was how to manage writings that they thought were both dangerous and potentially valuable at the same time. And in order to do that sort of selective censorship, I mean, it's one thing to burn books, but it's another thing to manage the text inside of them. So to do that sort of selective censorship properly, one would need to fully understand the text itself and to situate it in its wider corpus of related literature and to anticipate its possible uses and interpretations by different readers. Words have different meanings in different contexts, as we all experience, even in modern times. Now, the medieval Christian censors, even when, as they often were, aided by Hebrew literate converts from Judaism, failed to do this very effectively, this sort of selective censorship. And their failures and similar failings would continue to haunt the Index project for centuries to come. And this is quite similar to the text that we'll be looking at here. This is actually one from Ottawa, from the collection there, as censored by a convert in Venice in the 1500s. So debates raged through the 16th century and beyond, not only over precisely which books should in fact be banned, which books should be permitted or even encouraged in some cases for some people, and which ones should be expurgated, that is, partially censored in order to remove or rewrite objectionable content so that an otherwise useful book could be read without danger. And interestingly, at first these debates were limited to scholarly circles, with some royal oversight as well. Politics always gets involved. But it was above all the theology faculties of the universities of Paris and Leuven in Belgium, where Catholic professors in the 1540s were concerned with maintaining the orthodox of their curriculum for their students by identifying and banning Protestant materials. So this is actually the first book that I consider and that others consider to be part of the index tradition. It's not called an index, it's called the Catalogue des livres censurés by the faculty of the theology department in Paris, in 1544. The Spanish Inquisition, which had close ties to Leuven, since both of these areas, Spain and Belgium at the time, were both subject to the Habsburg King Philip II. So the Spanish Inquisition soon copied the Leuven professors' list to create a catalogus of their own. This is the first Spanish Inquisition index. Well, there were a few prototypes before it, but this is the first main one to be printed. And the Portuguese Inquisition also followed suit by 1551 with their own list. Meanwhile, in Italy, the local authorities in, above all, the book printing cities, such as Venice and Milan, developed their own lists of banned books. Again, mostly Protestant books, but also frequently targeting the Talmud. They knew the title. They didn't really know what they were banning by this point, but they knew the title and it bothered them. The Vatican, as we'll see in a minute, the Vatican itself at this time in the 1500s was really having a hard time dealing with Protestantism. It was absolutely riven by internal theological disputes. And so, in fact, the Vatican came quite late to the censorship table. It started in Paris with professors, Leuven with professors, then the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, then the Venetian Inquisition. The hardliner Pope Paul IV's efforts to publish the most extensive index to date failed with his death in 1559, so it wasn't until 1564, so 20 years after the first Paris one, that a more moderate Index Librorum Prohibitorum was finally printed with papal authority as determined by the Council of Trent, which had just closed. And this Tridentine Trent Index would remain the basis for papal book censorship for the next 402 years. But this didn't stop the Spanish and for a while the Portuguese from continuing to update the new indexes of their own in parallel. And this caused serious problems because the inquisitors of Rome and Spain didn't always agree with each other about just which of these books needed to be banned or expurgated and why, and above all, how to expurgate them. So in Spain, for example, the Index of Banned Books actually had a blanket clause at the beginning that said, all Hebrew books or books of the Jews, including translations into other languages besides Hebrew, with perhaps the exception of the Bible, as long as it was in Latin, all of these were theoretically prohibited. Everything. So we don't need titles, we don't need authors. All Hebrew books or books of the Jews, except for the Bible, which is actually ours, are banned. As were all copies of the Quran, or, again, this is a quote from that list, any other book in Arabic or in any other language wherein are contained the errors of the Mohammedan sect. So blanket ban, destroy them all. But simultaneously at the Vatican, influential figures such as the Cardinal Guglielmo Cerleto were deeply invested in the study of Hebrew scriptures. And the fact that Cerleto himself was actually the Vatican librarian at the time and simultaneously head of the congregation responsible for the index after 1571, this made his opinions especially powerful in Rome. And the Vatican libraries under Cerleto and his successors were also developing a program of Oriental language studies in this very period. So they were collecting books and recruiting native speakers of Arabic, Aramaic, and Ethiopian Ge'ez, as well as Japanese, Chinese, etc., eventually, to enhance not only the church's intellectual claims, but also to assist in its missionary ventures around the world. So for them, the Spanish approach of just burning all Hebrew books was a travesty. So you have an internal conflict between Spain and Rome over this. So the Italian indexes, those Tridentine indexes, developed more complicated policies, unlike the Spanish, whereby, for example, the Talmud, they would say the Talmud is banned unless it is purged of all anti-Christian content and as long as it doesn't have the actual word Talmud on it, because then we can pretend it's not really the thing that we've been banning. So legalism there. They knew about a book called Mahzor as well, that they knew that was a problem. Mahzorim were to be banned, according to the Italians, but only if they were translated into a vernacular language, such as Italian or Spanish, because this might tempt Christians to read them, and it turned out they were having a problem with Christians being a little too sympathetic to Jews these days. That could not happen. We have to make sure that we keep the lines solid between the religions. So, Mahzorim can be used by Jews in the original language, but not in translation. Meanwhile, Kabbalistic works and halachic works such as the Zohar or the Shulchan Aruch were permitted explicitly because these were of interest to Christian Hebraists, but only if they were subjected to prior censorship, again, by Hebrew literate converts. This is an example from a 1578 Venice copy of the Shulchan Aruch, which is banned, subject to expurgation by a Dominican convert from Judaism. He's the most prolific of these censors. This is Domenico Gerusalami. The scholar, modern scholar Amnon Raz Krakotskin at Ben Gurion University has done some really fascinating work. I'm indebted to him in looking at how the resulting adjustments and expurgations actually ended up shaping the development of internal Jewish understandings of these texts. Because in fact, the Shulchan Aruch was being drafted, was being assembled in exactly this time, and it was known that it was going to have to be subjected to censorship. So there was a certain amount of collaboration, tense collaboration, between the rabbis of Venice and the censors of Venice, who all knew each other from their schoolboy days because they came from the same community. Fascinating story that I won't get into here. Similar conflict and confusion arose over scientific texts, such as the writings by Galileo and others, because these were becoming more prestigious in the 17th century. In the 16th century, science was very indistinguishable from what we would today think of as magic. But in the 17th century, it was gaining a new prestige and therefore a new power. So the papacy, of course, famously banned Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1634. But again, interestingly, none of Galileo's works was ever placed on a Spanish index, partly because it wasn't translated into Spanish and the Spanish weren't reading it. It just wasn't really a problem for them. The division, so that's a minor example of the division between the Spanish and the Italians, but the division became much more acrimonious when it came to internal Catholic theological debates. The Spanish inquisitors, for example, decided to actually ban a book by a Roman Catholic cardinal named Enrico Norris in 1747. This is Enrico Norris. He's Henry Norris. He's Italian, but he was Irish, but he was working in Italy, so Enrico Norris. So they banned it in Spain. They banned all of his writings in Spain, or at least some of his writings in Spain. But an order to rescind the ban was very quickly issued by his friend, Pope Benedict XIV. And so subsequent editions of the Spanish Index of Prohibited Books, were themselves expurgated by censors. And in fact, the Spanish Index of 1747 was placed on the Index of Rome. So the censors were censoring the censors. It's great, you can't make this stuff up. And again, we can talk more about the complexities of this censorship process and the contradictions, because in addition to Spanish and Italian censors, and sometimes Portuguese, there were also freelance censors. And in the book, I discuss cases where you had individual priests censoring books in Mexico and then telling people back in Spain, we censored this, and then they send a memo back saying, you shouldn't have, but by then it's too late, and it takes years for this to get sorted out. Spinoza, there's an interesting censorship of Spinoza that we'll talk about. Raymond Lull, a famous medieval Christian who was interested in Kabbalah, gets on and off the index depending on the freelancer who's offended by his writings. One of my favorites, it's not actually in the book, I couldn't get an image of it, but anatomy textbooks weren't actually banned. A lot of people think that they would be, but the anatomy textbooks were fine, even illustrated ones with nude bodies. But I've seen a great example at the Wellcome Library in London where a very zealous censor went beyond the index by cutting out a little pair of underpants and gluing it over the picture of the nude body in the anatomy thing. It's great. So there's a lot of stories like these scattered across the long history of the Index of Prohibited Books. And over time, the censors turned their attentions to other things beyond religion and science. They turned to artistic works, both literary and visual, and even in some cases musical, which had really previously not been taken very seriously. This was especially true, of course, when they saw unacceptable religious or sexual content in the texts. This is the Marquis de Sade's Justine. It was censored, perhaps justifiably. It's a pretty horrible text, which I have tried to read some of. I read more 18th century porn than anyone ever should for this subject, for my sins. But this turn towards sexual and artistic censorship, it reflects not only an internal shift in Catholic perceptions and fears, but also a major cultural shift within the wider society. I mean, this sort of book didn't exist before. Not in the same way, anyway. It didn't have the same level of interest from the audience either. There were pornographic works before, but they were much more for a very small selection of gentlemen. But by the 18th century, it's getting a much larger reception, and it's in the vernacular instead of Latin. So there's all these things that make these books more dangerous in the eyes of the censors. The lay reading and theater-going public had really expanded in the late 18th century, and of course by the 19th century much more so. And this would explode even more in the 20th century with mass media transmissions, radio, film, all of this emerging as new ways for new sorts of ideas and images to develop. And this massification of the immediate mass media, this was a development that the censors struggled at first to confront as best they could, but finally it just contributed to a belated realization by the popes and the church at large that society had simply evolved to a point where their efforts were not only futile, but in fact counterproductive. And it took a while for them to realize that they really shouldn't be doing this anymore, that it was completely counterproductive. But it was already, the writing was on the wall by the end of the 19th century. These are just two examples of satirical works mocking the index. On the left, you have a list of pornographic books for connoisseurs of pornography. It's a recommendation of readings, right? So they're subverting the index idea by saying these are books that you should really get a hold of. And on the right, we have another example of, the index of things that should be prohibited for men to read. And it's just mockery. So the whole project had actually become an embarrassment to the church. And it was just impossible by that point for them to ban things. And they had no power anymore anyway. They really didn't control society in the way that they did in the 16th century. So what books were banned and which ones weren't, and how and why, and the whole process, ironically, served in some ways to undermine the very purpose that the censors originally sought to achieve. Not only because of the mockery, but in their earnest efforts to gather and evaluate and pass judgments that were themselves ultimately subject to challenge and correction over time, these men, who were themselves often highly educated and not always, I think, ill-intentioned, these were smart people, but these men actually ended up leaving a unique record of how academic, theological, and literary opinions have shifted over the centuries. This was a byproduct of my research. It ended up being a history of literature that the inquisitors had inadvertently recorded in their attempts to censor literature. They created a history of reading and literature. By studying the index, it turns out, we can learn a great deal about the censored, about the censors themselves, about the history of books and reading, not only in Catholic Europe, but also given the scope and ambitions of the Church in many parts of the wider world as well. And we were just talking earlier, my interest since writing this book has been very much about Quebec in the 20th century. And I realized that, you can learn a lot about Quebec society. Even after 1966, there continued to be attempts to have copies of lists of banned books distributed that went far beyond the index. These were compiled by French priests such as Saint-Jean and Bethlehem, and these were common things to have in every village in Quebec to ensure that local people didn't get their hands on bad books. Right into the 70s, the Quiet Revolution. So what lessons can we learn from all this history? I haven't time to go into everything now, obviously. I do hope that you'll all be able to read the book and you'll come up with your own answers to what we've learned. But I would like to touch on one important conclusion that I am still frankly wrestling with. Because one of the more uncomfortable results of working on this book, for me as a scholar myself, a somewhat liberal university professor and a champion of academic freedom that I consider myself to be, was the realization that the index itself, again, began and in some ways always remained an entirely academic project. We fight for academic freedom today, but the professors were the ones who demanded a list of banned books. The professors were the ones that invented this idea. Theology professors at Paris and Leuven, it was because they wanted to decide what was appropriate for their students, which of course nowadays we still manage what our students read. Later advisors to the Index project, including many librarians, whether in Rome or Madrid or further afield, were also generally selected for their academic credentials and expertise. So they weren't tasked with simply destroying all knowledge in the Orwellian sense. Their work, as they understood it, was in fact quite similar to what we academics still do today as we evaluate materials for publication through our research ethics evaluations and our peer review processes. We still use our training and professional judgment to determine which texts or other productions are in fact worthy of publication, which ones need changing, we could even call Bowdlerizing if we wanted to, edits, and which ones should be rejected, including at the extreme end of the spectrum, texts that might in fact be deceptive and or dangerous. And in many cases, such as medicine and the sciences or engineering, people's lives may be at stake if false claims are disseminated. So this process of discernment actually is an important role to play. And in politics too, we face difficult decisions sometimes when it comes to censorship. Ideally, many of us would like to live in a society where little or no censorship exists. That's my default position. But when false news and hate speech or open incitements to violence start to circulate, perhaps we might need to accept a little bit of judicious limitation on certain freedoms of expression in certain contexts. Boy, that forced me into saying something I didn't want to say. I think ideally this judicious limitation should be done by trusted and societally approved experts, whatever that might mean. But, we have to think about this carefully. Experts taking on the role of deciding just where, when, and how these limits should be placed. At the very least, I think maybe not defaulting to self-appointed religious and political leaders to do this. This is why maybe librarians, again, might have a role to play. It's in situations like this that I find myself realizing that perhaps we are not, after all, really so different from the inquisitors and index censors that I've been studying all these years. And again, that's a very sobering thought for me. Now, there's differences, of course. The main difference is that we generally have developed different concerns and different understandings of what is genuinely harmful or dangerous, right? Early modern Catholics and some modern religious folks of all sorts agreed that erring in matters of faith was a serious matter which justified taking harsh measures. Eternal salvation is important, and if you make a mistake, that's the worst mistake you can make. So for them, the concept of freedom of religion was nonsensical and actually downright unethical. We should not allow people to fall into errors like this. They also thought that bad science was dangerous to society, and that's why the index censors at times condemned not only the heliocentric theories of Galileo, but also what they considered to be quack science. We might be sympathetic to some of their decisions. There was one case I came across where they did decide to ban a book which was prescribing the topical application of chickpeas to cure cancerous tumors. I think we can probably agree that chickpeas are probably not the ideal cancer treatment. Wow. Maybe. We can debate this. We do also have concerns about dubious claims from peddlers of alternative cancer treatments or autism treatments or COVID treatments, even though by now most of us have accepted the idea that the Earth does rotate around the sun. But yeah, maybe we can debate that too. Now, but the other difference, the more important difference, I think, is that and again, this is something that I think we have to maintain this difference to keep us from falling into the worst excesses of the Church's Index of Prohibited Books. This is involving what we do with the texts that we deem to be problematic. Totalitarian destruction of knowledge, I think, is rarely, if ever, I'd say it's never a good thing. But certainly if it's done without sufficient consideration or when people are harmed in the process. There was, I think, I can state with no shame or problem that there was no justification whatsoever, sympathetic though I may be to some of their intentions, there was no justification for the Catholic inquisitors burning authors like Giordano Bruno at the stake, or suppressing the Talmud or the writings and languages of indigenous peoples, which they did, to the point of cultural genocide. No excuse for that at all. But the alternative maybe isn't to just simply accept that all writings should be circulated without any distinction or barriers whatsoever. Again, I hope there are reasonable ways in which we can decide as a society, and guided by experts such as scholars and librarians, to limit access to some writings in some situations, while nevertheless continuing to permit their existence. Because that existence may, after all, actually have some value, even if this is not immediately evident. Do we still need to read Mein Kampf sometimes to understand important things? Yes, but should it be in every kindergarten classroom? No. This is kind of my point. We can discuss this. This is not easy work, and as the history of the index shows, today's decisions may yet be rejected and ridiculed by future generations with the benefit of hindsight and changing circumstances. Nor will the decisions ever be accepted by every sector of society. Our current rounds of culture wars makes very clear that you'll never make everybody happy. I know this personally. But if done carefully and with a high degree of transparency, and again, expert as opposed to political or religious consultation, as well as a constant openness to challenge and appeal and change, then I think that this is likely the best way and most responsible way forward. Of course, we already do this to a great extent without calling it censorship. All publishers make choices about what to print and what to leave out, and sometimes what to change. We could again say Bowdlerize. And those changes all become a part of literary history. It's interesting to see how books have changed over time in the additions and the changes that have been made to them. But all librarians, too, must choose what goes on their shelves and what must be discarded or passed on to others. And all school boards must decide on textbooks that will be included in the curriculum, and this inevitably means that others are left off. But these are forms of discernment, not necessarily censorship, because they're just limiting or omitting books from circulating in specific locations, rather than destroying or criminalizing them altogether. So, in the end, this was an interesting exercise for me. I think that the study of the Index of Prohibited Books is important not only for understanding the specific experiences and injustices of the early modern Catholic past, and I think it is that, or of how books and book culture has evolved over the last 400 years. It is that too. But I would suggest that studying this history of censorship also shines light on an ongoing modern problem. The problem in the information age of how to properly and responsibly regulate the free circulation of information without either unduly infringing the rights of free expression or irresponsibly permitting harmful outcomes from arising due to its misuse. The Catholic censors of the 16th century failed miserably by our standards on both of these points. But we have inherited similar challenges, albeit in new trappings, to the ones that they believed they faced. And it's up to us to do a better job. So, that's it. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussion in the questions in the time we have remaining. And I really look forward to looking more closely at these censored gems from the collection here at the Jewish Public Library. So thanks again very much for the opportunity.
In the time we have left, I'm going to maybe expedite some of what I had prepared to talk to you about, because you probably end up having more questions for Robin than you have with me, and I'm here for longer than the next 4 or 5 hours. You can always come and talk to me about this. We had as we were cataloging our rare book collection from 2014, it took us about 2 years to do this. We came across a number of anomalies. Some of them were explicit, some of them were implicit. The most explicit case of censorship was the Merkavit Mishnah. The Merkavit Mishnah, which in English translates roughly to the Second Chariot, is a commentary on Deuteronomy by Yehuda Abravanel, Isaac Yehuda Abravanel, who lived in the last part of the 15th century. And to understand him in context, what you need to understand is that the Inquisition was still very fresh in the minds of Jews who had fled to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, and to Italy, and to all of the the countries in Europe. The reason that Deuteronomy was his chosen book was that Deuteronomy had particular significance for many Jews, particularly because it was an affirmation of some of the basic tenets of Judaism. Barbanel focuses on a passage of Deuteronomy 4:29. From thence will you seek the Lord your God, and you shall find him if you search after him with all your heart and all your soul. And he comments on this particular passage in his commentary in light of the fact that there were so many conversos who made their way to Italy. And he referred to these conversos as worshiping the gods of the nations indeed, but the God of Israel with all, that is only their heart and soul. So there was a particular sense of anxiety and anger and reticence on the part of Barbanel in commenting on offering this commentary on Deuteronomy. That's why he chose Deuteronomy, as he saw this as the affirmation of the creed of Judaism. Now, Jews had been in Italy for 2 centuries by the time Barbanel was writing this. Christians were able to derive fees from licenses, printing licenses, bookmaking supplies, and there was a degree of freedom. In the 1516, even in the Venetian ghetto, Venetian Jews were allowed to print books provided that they hired Christian printers to print them for them. There were sporadic attempts to interfere by the church, but these were objected to by Christian academics who relied very heavily on Hebrew books. There was a lot of exchange. The Golden Age was still not quite over yet, so there was still a lot of exchange and reciprocity that was happening in this part of Europe. But what happened was, in the year that the Merkavit appeared, which was 1551, a papal court case was heard by 2 rival Venetian Christian printers of Hebrew books. A rabbi by the name of Meir Katzenelebogen was trying to shop his commentary to the Mishnah Torah around to rival printers. And the first printer that he approached was the Giustiniani Press, which was a fairly well-known press, and he shopped it around, he submitted it to them, and he got the standard rejection note. Thank you, sir, your submission doesn't require it doesn't suit our present needs. And what he did was he convinced a newer printer, the Bragadin Press, to print it, and they did, to resounding success. That once the Giustiniani printers saw the success of this printing, they came out with a rival edition. And this broke an understanding, a well-established understanding in the printing industry, whereas if you printed an edition of a particular work, you had to leave a period of time to elapse before before an identical printing would happen. And a court case was heard. It made its way to the Vatican, and the Vatican, I guess one could say the Vatican overreacted, and Pope Julius responded. Pope Julius III responded by ordering the confiscation and burning of all copies of the Talmud and many other Hebrew books located in Rome. Now, the way that this affected the Merkavit Mishnah is this came out in the same year. This came out in 1551, and this was the year that Pope Julius handed down his edict. So bad timing on the part of Abravanel. Now, Jews often found themselves legally compelled to bring their books to censors. These were, as Robin had mentioned, these were usually Jews recently converted to Christianity, sometimes with suspect knowledge of Hebrew and Judaism for that matter. And in addition to that, the church overseers added another variable to this series of papal-approved orders, book lists, and implied guidelines that they utilized, all of which frequently changed. So you could bring a book to a censor, it would be censored, you would get it back, but then another censor could demand that you return it to them, and another passage would be censored. Completely different passage that would be censored. And to add insult to injury, the Jewish book owners generally had to pay for the privilege of having their books censored. We actually have here 2 copies of the Merkavit Mishnah. One is censored, one is not. I'll just show them. Is it all right if I lift them up just a little bit? Okay. The most egregious, you can't believe how difficult it was for Ezel and Ellen to actually put these little mounts up.
You can move the little thing.
Okay. This is the most egregious example of censorship, and the book has a lot of censored passages in it. But here you have an entire swath of text that was entirely excised from the final printing. Now we have actually an identical edition printed the same year, completely uncensored. And there have been a number of editions of this that have been traced to various university libraries. And passages censored in one text don't appear in another text. In other words, there are censored passages in some editions that don't appear in other editions. So as Robin was saying, the fact of inconsistency really didn't make this a universally successful enterprise, censorship, by any stretch of the imagination. Now, eventually, and I should point out that, what was it? The questions that we often get in our workshops is, what was it in these texts that were so objectionable? Well, Abravanel compared the Jews and society of his time, which was just after the Inquisition, to the events in the Bible. He also describes Christians as uncircumcised villains, unclean robbers, and idol worshippers of a man-made God. And he also makes reference to Jewish converts to Christianity in very pejorative terms. And I can't actually tell you at which point in the text this actually occurs, but he refers to King Ferdinand as Ashmedai, king of the demons, which is not something you want to do, especially when you have to get your book passed by the censors. Oddly enough, during the time of the Inquisition, Abravanel was a very wealthy man. He was a merchant. He was very well respected in the in the Portuguese monarchical circles. And it was said that he even paid King Ferdinand a sum of money to prevent the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And of course, that didn't work out too well, as we later found out. The book was printed by Rabbi Tobias Lazarus ben Eliezer Foa, who was a very wealthy emigre from Sevagliano, Italy. And he was very well respected. His printer was the pet project of a duke in Mantua. And he was very well known, this duke was very well known for having a very tolerant perspective on the Jews who had lived there for at least a century. He was very learned in Italian literature. He had studied the Talmud and Kabbalah, and was highly respected Jews and Jewish thought. So we have since found a couple of other censored editions of books that we have in the rare book collection, but what I'd really like to turn to right now is this one. And what we usually do in our workshops is this is much easier to show around without it falling apart in your hands. And what we usually ask people to do is take a look at the title page and tell me what you think is wrong with it. Well, the fact is, title pages were a fairly contemporary innovation by this time. They'd only started about 100 years earlier. A lot of books didn't have title pages at all. But there are actually several things wrong with this title page, but what's missing? There's something particularly important missing on this title page.
The author?
Correct. There's no author. Now, why would that be?
On purpose.
Right. Why would that be?
Because he wasn't important. To hide his background.
To hide his background, exactly. I think you've been at one or two of these workshops before, mind you, but okay. Okay. I am really annoying. Okay, yes, the author's name is missing from this title page, but in addition to that, the imprint is listed as being in Hamburg, place of publication. It was not. Now, there's absolutely no way you could have known that by looking at the title page, but that's only one of the that's only one of the three problems on this title page. The third one is that the publisher is completely bogus. Okay, this was written by Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. We're very quick when we do the slides to actually put the author's name. I actually had to remind Giselle to take it out because this was part of the exercise. Now, you all know about Spinoza. I'm not going to go into Spinoza's life. If you're actually interested in reading about this, an entire book has been written about the Theologico-Politicus, a book forged in hell written by a very well-known Spinoza scholar, Stephen Nadler. So rather than just repeat what's in the book, please borrow it from the library. But this book, Spinoza by this time had already been excommunicated. So there was very little love lost between him and the Jewish community. But he was still printing, he was still publishing during this time. Amsterdam during this time was flooded with subversive and clandestine writings, political, religious, erotic, works that were critical of monarchical regimes or ecclesiastical power. And a man by the name of Jan Riewerts, who is the printer here, I don't think we have, on the book, on the title page itself, the printer is listed as being Heinrich Kunrad. Henrikum Kunrad. Now that's a made-up name. The real printer was Jan Riewerts. He had a bookstore, a bookshop called the Book of Martyrs in Amsterdam. And he had a reputation for publishing liberal and radical books. One of the authors, one of the philosophers that he published was René Descartes. Also not terribly well liked. Riewerts was accused of holding anti-Trinitarian views and holding meetings of this heretical sect in his home. He, however, had this reputation for publishing authors that no one else would publish. And in early 1669, Spinoza brought him the manuscript to publish. They had probably known each other for about 15 years. It was well known that Spinoza used Riewerts' address as a post office box for letters that were being sent from other countries. And Spinoza often lodged in his home in Amsterdam. And in the late 16th century, all published material required approval and permission from the States of Holland. In 1615, there was an edict intended to encourage provincial and municipal bodies to engage in what they called protective censorship. But there was such an onslaught of published material. Now, as you know, the Netherlands was considered to be the most tolerant country in all of Europe. So there was such an onslaught of published material. All the levels of government couldn't keep up. Provincial bodies left it to municipalities. Municipalities left it to smaller organizations. And there was such decentralization that there were so many inconsistencies and lax enforcement that the fact of censorship was pretty much a moot point in Amsterdam for a long period of time. There was relative freedom of the press, but not complete freedom. Riewerts' press, however, was under surveillance by diverse persons of all sorts, being seen coming out of his shop, engaged in what they called singular conversations. But the authorities could only prosecute responsible parties if they knew who they were. Thus, you have the title page. There's no authorship associated on the title page. Now, he ascribed the responsibility of printing to the name Heinrich Kunrad, who was a German alchemist and Rosicrucian in the second half of the 16th century. But he also used other names. He used names like Jacobus Poli, Isaacus Hercules, and Carolus Graciani. He also, in one of his other publications, listed the place of publication as Eleutheropolis, which is a completely made-up name. It was really Amsterdam. But in the case of the Tractatus, in the case of Spinoza's work, he wasn't leaving anything to chance, and he left the name of the place of publication as Amsterdam. Now, throughout the early 1670s, various academics and clerics eventually unmasked Spinoza as the author of the work. Spinoza at this point didn't particularly care. He didn't feel like he had anything to lose. He'd already been excommunicated by his Jewish brethren. And in fact, there was a letter in 1671 that he wrote to the philosopher Leibniz, which was it was a bit odd because he didn't really know Leibniz all that well, and he admitted that he was the author of this work. Ultimately, though, in the years leading up to 1674, the Tractatus was the object of confiscation, litigation in the Dutch courts, and finally banned in the Dutch Republic, forged in hell by the apostate Jews working together with the devil and published with the knowledge and complicity of Jan Rewerts. And in 1679, Robin and I were discussing this at some point. It was placed in the Church's Index of Prohibited Books along with the Ethics, which was his other famous work, as well as the Politics and all of his correspondence. Oddly enough, there was silence. It's uncharacteristic, I think. There was silence on the part of the Jewish authorities on the Tractatus. I think by this time they were already done with him. But the joke was probably on them eventually, because the Tractatus and many of other Spinoza's works, which heralded the beginning of secularism in Europe, what they called Jewish secularism, played a very important role in the rise of the Haskalah in the 18th century. Very much an influence on people like Moses Mendelssohn. So these are just two examples of works that had significant mediation, either by expurgation or omission, in this particular case in the title page in our rare book collection. So I've sped through this a little bit, but if you're actually interested in reading the background of this book, I would highly encourage you to read A Book Forged in Hell. It's a really, really remarkable book. Thank you.